Award. He has lectured and published widely. He now serves as historian and president of the Jewish Heritage North Carolina. He conceived and served as historian for its multimedia project, Down Home: Jewish Life in North Carolina. His books include Homelands, Southern Jewish Identity in Durham and Chapel Hill, North Carolina Down Home: Jewish Life in North Carolina, and Gertrude Weil, a Jewish progressive in the New South, winner of the 2017 North Carolina Historical and Literary Association's Annual Award for Nonfiction. Please keep yourselves on mute. I will monitor questions in the chat box. And now it's my privilege to introduce our speaker, Leonard Rogoff.
Thank you, Annette. North Carolina was thought not to really have a Jewish history relative to Virginia and South Carolina, which had Jewish communities dating since colonial days. If you look at the population, can we move the PowerPoint on? Okay. Okay, that's our title. I'll move on to the next one. Okay, all right, fine. All right, and then move on to our next one, please. Okay, if you look at the population statistics, you'll see that North Carolina has had an extremely small percentage of population, though not the smallest in the country, though not in absolute numbers. But Jews have always been significant beyond their numbers. Jews are here from whenever I went looking for Jews, I found them. They were here from the very, very first. In 1585, in Sir Walter Raleigh's second expedition to Roanoke Island, Joachim Gans was the mineralogist of the expedition. He was the first Jew to arrive in British North America. I always like to think of Gans as our contemporary. He was a professional, a scientist. He was migratory. He was a native of Prague, and then moved on to England, and then came on to the Americans. And also he was isolated as a Jew. And what brought him here was commerce, global capitalism. He was brought here to find precious metals. Okay. When the fundamental constitutions of the Carolinas was written in 1669, Jews were welcomed as well as heathens and other dissenters from the purity of Christian religion. The first Jews who came to North Carolina belonged to what historians now identify as a port Jews, a port Jewish phenomenon. Port cities were, with the rise of global capitalism, were cosmopolitan places that brought in diverse populations. And in the case of Jews, their potential for profit made them more welcome than any prejudice that they held against them for the religion. I think you're probably all familiar with what's called the three-wave theory of Jewish migration to America. From the 1660s to the 1820s was the Sephardic or Spanish Portuguese wave, which brought about 2,500 Jews to America. In the 19th century, about 150,000 German-speaking Jews arrived. And from the 1880s to the 1920s, about 2.5 million East European Jews arrived. That sort of works. By the 1730s, most of the immigrants, in fact, were Germanic Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, not Sephardim. And the Sephardic migration was really numerically almost insignificant. When North Carolina wrote its constitution in 1776, okay, well, yeah, we do find evidence of Spanish Portuguese Jews in North Carolina. Most of them were related to Aaron Lopez, who you saw pictured with the port Jews, who lived in Newport, Rhode Island. Lopez, in fact, was probably the most significant Jew in North Carolina's early history. He sent something like 38 ships to North Carolina, and he put members of his family as his agents in coastal ports like Edenton, New Bern, and Wilmington. So there was a Sephardic presence in Wilmington in the early days. In 1776, when North Carolina wrote its state constitution, it reflected both Enlightenment values on the rights of man, as well as more ancient medieval prejudices. Thus, one article gave each person the unalienable right to worship Almighty God according to the dictates of their own consciences. On the other hand, there was a religious test that confined public office to the truth of the Protestant religion. North Carolina was one of 10 states to have a religious test, despite the fact that our federal constitution had a Bill of Rights. The religious test came to the fore in 1808 when Jacob Henry, a Jew from Carteret County, was elected to the General Assembly, and a year later his right to serve was challenged. Jacob Henry delivered a very spirited defense of religious freedom and was allowed to hold his seat. But the religious test persisted. In 1835, it was changed from the truth of the Protestant religion to Christian to include Catholics. In 1861, Christian was removed, but that was in the Confederate Constitution, which was invalidated in 1865. And it was not until 1868 with our current Constitution, which requires only a belief in Almighty God. So in the 1835 North Carolina Constitution engaged in a program of internal improvements. There had really been nothing to draw Jews to North Carolina. We had a swampy coast, no major ports, our rivers were not navigable. But after the 1835 Constitution, the state embarked on the program of internal improvements. And we start seeing a German Jewish migration to North Carolina, which especially after 1848, when the liberal revolutions in Germany failed, the Jewish migration increased. And Jews were pushed by poverty, restrictions in terms of their occupations, places of residence, and even marriage. These were what we call Dorfjuden, village Jews. And then they found in North Carolina places very much like they left. There were rural towns, and Jews took up positions as peddlers and shopkeepers. They were middlemen between city and countryside, between the wholesalers and manufacturers and their customers. This was what is called a family chain migration. Jacob Rader Marcus, the dean of American Jewish historians, famously quipped that no Jew was ever the first to come to a community. He was always preceded by his uncle. Most Jews who came began as peddlers. We know this from the R.G. Dunn credit reports, which were compiled by local bankers, lawyers, and merchants from the 1840s to the 1880s. And we get some sense of the public attitudes towards Jews. Thus, H. Mitchenheimer and Rocky Mount in 1858 is described as, quote, Jew, hawks or peddles goods with the wagon. Such men are always regarded with distrust here. That was pretty typical of the attitude towards Jews. In 1866, a Confederate veteran, Morris Cohn, opened a variety store in Hillsborough, and he printed a very charming advertising poem that ends, he'll take just what you bring to sell, and though called Jew, will treat you well. So you get a sense of what the public attitudes are. If you want to see where Jews are settled in North Carolina in the 19th century, follow the railroad. The railroad fever started in the 1830s and 1840s, but it was especially the North Carolina Railroad built in the 1850s from Goldsboro to Charlotte that led to economic development of the state. The Goldsboro itself was named after a railroad engineer. High Point was named after the highest point on the railroad. Towns like Greensboro, which just had been little farming villages, attracted warehouses and mills. You now had access to Baltimore and New York. Cotton could be shipped up north. Finished goods could be sent down south. And we see this, for example, at the terminus of the railroad in Charlotte had 9 Jews in 1850. By 1860, it had 57 Jews. So we start seeing the growth of Jewish population there. So there was little to attract Jews to this area. Chapel Hill just remained a village with a small college. There's no commerce. There may have been a Jewish store in there in the 1840s. Durham was a farm neighborhood. It had a railroad depot in 1849, but it was not until 1869 that it was actually incorporated as a city. Raleigh was different. It was a state capital and a county seat, so there was always commerce. There were always people coming and going, so it had more opportunities. The railroad had arrived as early as the 1830s and 1840s. Most people generally when you ask them informally about the history of Jewish Raleigh, they'll start with George Washington Mordecai and his brother Moses Mordecai. George himself was a convert. Both George and Moses married into the first families of Raleigh, the Lanes and Camerons. These were slaveholding, very wealthy plantation families. George was a communicant at the Episcopal Church. Moses attended church, apparently without converting. However, we know from a letter that their sister Emma wrote while visiting Raleigh in 1821 that she held Yom Kippur services in their home. Emma fasted and read the liturgy, although she noted neither of her brothers either fasted or prayed. She observed that her sister-in-law, Harriet Lane, had her brother Augustus read Isaac Leeser's The Jews and the Mosaic Law. Emma, all of her life, like her parents, remained an observant Jew. The real founders of the Jewish community of Raleigh were Michael and Regina Grousman. This is Michael Grousman's tombstone in Oakwood. They moved from Warrenton to Raleigh in 1862. They were Bavarian immigrants. Despite the religious test, which was largely ignored in the state, Michael Grousman worked for the state treasury during the Civil War. He was a Confederate tailor. Grousman had had some rabbinic training. He owned a Torah scroll, and he kept a room in his house that he used as the local synagogue. He trained local boys for a bar mitzvah. According to the Dunn reports, he was, quote, a German Jew. He is a man of fine character, good credit, and habits. From 1854 to 1879, the Dunn credit reports lists 62 Jewish merchants in Raleigh. Some only stayed for months. Jews were extremely highly mobile, and their names are Nathan, Sloman, Rosenbaum, Rosenthal, Heller, Berlinger, Schwab, Ettinger. This again was an extended family chain migration. We can see this with the Rosenthal family. In the lower there is Emil and Eva Ettinger, Rosenthal's daughter Nina, who was born in Raleigh in 1849. There was a Leopold Rosenthal at a dry goods store. He brought his nephews Isidore and David to town. Gustav Rosenthal arrived from Wilmington in the 1870s. The Emil Rosenthals eventually moved to Wilson and then Goldsboro. And all these families were connected. The Rosenthals married Ettingers, Grousmans. If you went down the 100 to 200 block of Fayetteville Street near the state capitol, you would have seen Gerson Heller's shoe store. J.M. Rosenbaum was a clothier. Morris Rosenbaum had linens and notions. Louis Free confections. And Jews typically made that classic Jewish climb from peddler to storekeeper to wholesaler to investing in real estate, both in urban properties and in farmlands. The Dunn credit report reflected some ambivalence about Jews. Thus, in 1869, this is Isaac Ettinger is described, quote, her husband is a Jew, but is responsible and reliable, leading milliner of the city, honest but sharp. Jacob Rosenbaum, 1866, a Jew, sober, industrious, has a good name, worthy man. On the other hand, in 1866, A. Klein is a Jew and doubtful. The two earliest Jews to arrive in Chapel Hill were Marx Lazarus, who was a grandson of Jacob Mordecai, who was a member of the class of 1841, and Professor Henry Harris, who was a French Jew of Russian origin. Harris apparently was harassed by his students, and there's speculation that he had abolitionist sympathies. Where did Jews stand on the issue of slavery? And when the Civil War arose, well, we have evidence of Jewish slaveholding. Jews advertised slaves for sale. I found one instance of a Jewish slave dealer. The Mordecai were slaveholders. On the other hand, Michael Grousman opposed slavery. He employed only free Blacks. He tutored the children of his African-American employees, and with his wife, Regina, sponsored the education of his employees' daughters to nursing school, who are the first African-American nurses in North Carolina. In 1854, Nathan Kramer was described by the Dunn Credit reports as a German Jew paying his debts, but has a rather bad odor as to his trading with slaves and Negroes and Indians without a permit. When the Civil War came, Jews flocked to join the Confederate Army. Some 70 North Carolina Jews served, but their primary contribution was economic. Jews such as Grousman were making uniforms for the Confederate Army, and this was really the start of Jews' involvement in the garment industry. In Wilmington, there were a number of Jewish blockade runners. The real settlement of Jews came in the Reconstruction era as the South endeavored to rebuild after its defeat. The slaves had been freed, and Southern society was reordering itself on the basis of race. And the racial status of Jews came into question. Now, Jews were not regarded so much, being Jewish was regarded not so much as adhering to a religion as being a member of a race. Southerners wanted white immigration. Immigration societies formed to redress the racial imbalance of the South. Jews had their defenders, and probably the most noted of the defenders was the Civil War governor and later US Senator Zebulon Vance. At a time, believe it or not, when delivering public lectures was considered entertainment, Vance was a nationally known speaker on the Chautauqua circuit. And his most famous speech was called The Scattered Nation. It was a philo-Semitic speech. And he referred to the Jews as our wondrous kinsmen, our spiritual father. He praised them as the money kings, but he also praised Jews by disparaging African American. If you read it today, it's an embarrassing piece of racial gibberish, but for the Jews of its time, including up to the present day, Vance became a hero. The B'nai B'rith in Wilmington presented him with the silver cane. And even in 1995, a Jewish publisher in Charlotte reprinted the Scattered Nation. During the Reconstruction era, there was an increased migration of Jews into America. This was a migration, again, working its way eastward into Prussia and Posen, which is the Western Poland. In 1870, there were 300 Jews in North Carolina. 210 of whom were born in German lands. The post-Civil War era was marked by a religious revival, and the 1870s were really the birthright years of American Judaism, of institutional Judaism in America. That's when the Union of American Hebrew Congregations formed, Hebrew Union College formed, and we see this also on the local level. And communities across America and in North Carolina as well are organizing according to the Talmudic injunction, first the cemetery, then the city. The first Jewish institution in North Carolina was actually before the Civil War, was in Wilmington, the Wilmington Hebrew Cemetery, still in use. But in Charlotte, we see a cemetery society forming in 1867, followed by a Chaver Kadisha, a burial society, and a Ladies Benevolent Society. In Raleigh, the Hebrew Cemetery Society dates to 1870. A year later, they take a deed to the Oakwood Cemetery. In 1874, a Jewish Cemetery Society in Durham. B'nai B'rith Lodges formed in Wilmington, starting in 1874, then in Tarboro, Charlotte, and Goldsboro. In 1874, Business Directory lists a synagogue at Michael Grousman's house. Michael Grousman is described as the rabbi. By 1883, the Jews take rooms above Rosenbaum's millinery to serve as a synagogue. The first synagogue in North Carolina is the Temple of Israel in Wilmington, built in 1876, which is still in use. In 1886 is Oheb Shalom in Goldsboro. In 1892, Temple Emmanuel in Statesboro, still in use. B'nai Israel and Tarboro. By the end of Reconstruction, marks an era of white redemption and white supremacy. The institution of Jim Crow is established. Where did Jews stand at this particular point? We're all acquainted by now with the race riot of Wilmington in 1898. In fact, the mayor of Wilmington before and after, although not during the race riot, was a merchant, Solomon Fishblade. Fishblade was among the leaders of the crowd that went to burn the African-American press that allegedly had provoked the riot. Nathaniel Jacoby, a prominent merchant and synagogue leader, was one of the authors of the White Declaration of Independence. On the other hand, if you go up the coast to New Bern, you would have found Joseph Hahn, again, who is also active in New Bern's Jewish community, was elected on a Black Republican ticket as sheriff. He stood before crowds of Blacks, urging them to fight and to resist. And as sheriff, you can see an editorial cartoon that appeared in the Raleigh News and Observer, attacking Joseph Hahn for the offense of chaining a Black and white prisoner together and bringing them to Raleigh. Jews at this time, not until the Roosevelt era, were Jews identified with a specific political party. This was also the era of a New South. In 1886, the journalist Henry Grady in Atlanta delivered a very famous speech in which he called for a New South, that cities would become hives of industry, racial harmony would prevail, the South would transition from agriculture to industry. Mill fever swept the South. There was a gospel of industry. The cry was, bring the cotton mills to the cotton fields. From 1880 to 1890, the number of mills quadrupled, the number of mill workers multiplied 9 times. Country folk flocked from the countryside into the cities, and Jews were very much involved with this. The Cohn brothers built a textile empire, headquartered in Greensboro. The Wallace brothers built the world's largest herbarium in Statesville. Solomon Bear was the leading distiller when the liquor industry was still significant in North Carolina. The Jews were welcomed for their capital and commercial skills. When I do oral histories, very often people would tell me, well, my father or my grandfather first arrived in town as a peddler, and he met a mill owner, and the mill owner told him he wanted him, agreed to lend him money and sponsor him if he would only open up a store in town. They wanted commerce for their town. And again, we start saying this is the era when cities are rising. And the economic center of North Carolina moves from the coast into the Piedmont. And from 1880 to 1920, the population of Raleigh grows from 9,000 to 24,000. Durham grows an astonishing from 2,000 to 21,000. This era coincides with the immigration of East European Jews to America. 2.5 million Jews arrived. And again, like the Germans, they achieved an economic niche in dry goods. With the East European immigration, North Carolina's Jewish population rises from 820 in 1878 to over 8,000 in 1927. The number of synagogues rise from 1 to 22. The Jews who came south came here by way of a staged migration. First, they settled in New York or Baltimore. Harry Kaplan arrived. He was sent down here with a sign around his neck. Apparently, he was a young Yiddish-speaking immigrant, didn't know English, so they put a sign around his neck, Kaplan, Raleigh, and put him on a train. Jews were too few to factionalize then, so Germans and East Europeans, all met together, and Clarice Grousman Elias, Michael and Regina's daughter, conducted Americanization and English lessons for the newly arriving immigrants. There was less Jewish ethnic tension in small towns than you would have typically found in urban areas. The first large significant number of East European Jews, again, these are the arrival of the East European Jews. This is the Foxman family who arrived in Raleigh. The Bear family settled in Fayetteville, but some of their members worked their way to Raleigh. The first significant number of Jews to arrive were the tobacco workers who came in the early 1880s. Buck Duke went to New York and found Moses Gladstein leading a strike of Jewish immigrant cigarette rollers in New York. He brought them down to New York, to Durham, to roll cigarettes in his factory. They did what all good Jewish proletarians do, which is they formed a union and started to radicalize the local workers. Buck Duke got rid of them and automated, mechanized cigarette production and sort of drove them away. A few of them did remain here. Some of you may recall Paul Seligson from the Raleigh community. His father had been a Duke cigar roller. And the Harris sisters, their father, Bernard, I think his name was a cigarette roller. Moses Gladstein was the labor contractor, remained in Durham and opened up a store. His family is still there. But the ambition of the workers was not to remain in a sweatshop. They were aspiring capitalists. And that's why Seligson, Harris, and Gladstein all became store owners. If you look and make a comparison, in New York in 1910, 73% of the Jews were involved in manufacturing in sweatshops, none in Durham. 16% of the Jews were self-employed in trade. In Durham, it was closer to 80%. When I do oral histories in Hickory, in places like Hickory or Oxford or Weldon, and I ask them, what brought your father or grandfather to the small town, North Carolina, I usually invariably get an answer that begins in the Baltimore Bargain House. The Baltimore Bargain House was the largest wholesaler in America. And Baltimore was really the Jewish capital of North Carolina. The Bargain House was owned by Jacob Epstein, who had arrived himself in America in the 1870s as a Lithuanian immigrant. He had peddled and then become fabulously wealthy. He had a soft spot for Jewish immigrants like himself, and he had agents on the docks and railroad stations who would bring Jewish immigrants to his office. He would look at a map and say, there's a new railroad spur going to Zebulon, there's a new mill opening in Durham, they could use the store, I'll give you credit, I'll give you some merchandise, you go down there, pay me back when you can. When you get married, I'll send you a nice wedding gift. If we go and look, for example, here is a receipt from Morris Goodman in Raleigh in 1892 from Epstein. And if you look at it carefully, you'll see that it's written in Yiddish. Jews maintained a kind of separate ethnic economy. The North Carolina economic landscape differed from most other states. In most other states, there's a concentration of Jews in the metropolitan center, such as Atlanta, Baltimore, and New York. North Carolina never had that. North Carolina was a place of small towns. In 1927, there were 13 towns with more than 100 Jews, but none with more than 1,000. A 1929 survey found the exceptional fact that Jews were scattered in 188 towns concentrated in the Piedmont. At that time, Asheville was the largest with 700, followed by Charlotte and Goldsboro with 400. Seemingly every town had a Jew store. In the 1930s, a UNC graduate student in sociology, Bill Levitt, followed his father, who was a traveling salesman across the state, to do a survey of North Carolina Jews. He found that nearly 60% were proprietors, which was double the percentage of other whites and triple the percentage of Blacks. Virtually no Jews were unskilled labor. And again, like the Germans, the Jews had an economic niche in dry goods, but Jews did other things as well. They owned pawn shops. The Finkelstein brothers, 5 brothers, had pawn shops from Wilmington to Asheville. A lot of Jews without any resources began as junk peddlers, collecting scrap and metal and glass. Virtually every city had at least one Jewish scrapyard. Saul Kaplan had a dairy farm outside of Raleigh. But most typical for Jews was the family store. In 1899, Abe Kaplan had a Raleigh grocery. 4 years later, he had a furniture store. 7 years later, a dress shop. One of my favorites is in Whiteville, his Man's store in the upper right corner. I don't know if you can see it, but on the sign outside the store, he emblazoned a Star of David. And he also emblazoned stars of David on his shopping bags. Some of these Jewish stores, there's a store for Max Samet. You probably see all the Samet construction signs on I-40 now, heading towards Greensboro. Heilig and Myers started with a secondhand store in 1911 in Goldsboro and built the world's largest retail furniture chain. Leon Levine started his family dollar store, first in Rockingham and then Charlotte, built a chain of over 6,000 stores. And we see this again in Raleigh. In 1909, there were 8 Jewish men's clothing stores. By 1938, there were 24 dry goods stores. And Jewish stores catered to Black trade. In both Durham and Raleigh, in Black neighborhoods, you would have found Jewish grocers and Jews in Jewish stores in Black business districts. Virtually every town also had a Jewish-owned department store. In Raleigh, it was Klein Lazarus. In Chapel Hill on Franklin Street, it was the Berman's department store. Durham had Kronheimer's and Evans United store. The store was a way of integrating Jews into Southern society. If you think about it, a Jewish merchant, a storekeeper, needs to create goodwill if he's going to succeed in town. So Jews became parts of their community. They joined small town life. They played on the sports fields. In 1883, Gustav Rosenthal served on the Raleigh Board of Aldermen. There were Jews on the school board. Helen Grousman Elias was one of the founders of Raleigh's Women's Club and the PTA. When World War I came, Jews rushed to join the military. Max Pizer on the right there was the first draftee in Raleigh. Arthur Blumenthal of Wilmington was the first North Carolinian to be killed in World War I. With the integration of Jews into society, we start seeing congregations form. And the post-World War I years were marked by, after the Civil War, by a religious revival. And Jews, again, it was no longer sufficient for Jews to meet in rooms above a store, but they built these what are called cathedral-style synagogues, which attest to their prosperity and their population growth. And we see names like Raleigh Hebrew Congregation or Durham Hebrew Congregation, which is reflecting their civic loyalty. A synagogue in the South especially is a Jewish church in which Jews are staking their space in the faith community. And church building was a civic responsibility. Jews gave to the building of churches, both Black and white, and Blacks and Christian Blacks and whites gave to the building of synagogues, including Ben Duke in Durham and Governor O. Max Gardner in Raleigh. The fact that there were few Jews in the communities were small, meant compromise. And the Jews did not split between Reform and Orthodox until the population reached a critical mass. The catalyst in Raleigh came in 1913 when, in a conflict in the Hebrew school over the use of English, which led to the building, to the split between Reform Beth Or and Orthodox Beth Jacob. The typical Southern model that you found in towns is what's called the shul, or the synagogue, and the temple. So House of Jacob, which had first met over Sam Glass's store in 1923, bought a house the Rebbetzin had operated a deli on the first floor, and the rabbi killed the chickens out back. In 1925, Beth Or built a neoclassical style temple, which you can see in the middle there. To the left, you can see this is the Heilig Levine furniture. They had the upper floors is where the Beth Or first met. And in the 1880s, the Durham Jews first rented a civic hall. Then in 1905, they built a house. And then in 1921, they built the synagogue that you see in the lower corner. The second generation of Jews began their upward climb of mobility, and the colleges and the universities were really agencies of social mobility, although the Jews did encounter some prejudice there. UNC, Chapel Hill, was a school of choice for most North Carolina men and women's college for women. Duke, on the other hand, I have evidence in the 1930s, they kept a quota of 3%. Helen Grousman found a happy reception at St. Mary's, and Gertie Rosenthal at Peace. By 1912, there was a Hebrew Cultural Society at UNC, and for Jewish fraternities in the 1920s. North Carolina State had its first Jewish fraternity in 1936, which was the year that North Carolina Hillel was established. As far as I can tell, the first Jewish professor at North Carolina State was Abraham Rudy, who arrived in 1907. He's pictured there in the center. He taught modern languages. He had a PhD from NYU. He was a native of Riga, Lithuania. He was quite eccentric. He was best known as an expert in the international language of Esperanto. He invented an airplane, which his mischievous students hung from a smokestack. But he was active in the Jewish community as a leader of youth groups at the House of Jacob and at the YMHA. Perhaps the most notable Jew in North Carolina was Gertrude Weil, who's pictured at far left. Again, her father was a Bavarian immigrant. Her mother was the Nina Rosenthal Weil, this picture we saw, born in Raleigh. She was a graduate of Smith College. She was the president of the North Carolina Equal Suffrage Association, led the fight for women's suffrage in North Carolina, and was the founding president of the State League of Women Voters. The post-war years were not necessarily happy years for Jews. In 1915, a second Ku Klux Klan revived. After World War I, there were campaigns for 100% American. Nativism arose after the war, just as we are seeing its resurgence again today. In 1921 and 1924, Congress imposed restrictions that put an end to open immigration, and social discrimination led to university quotas, housing covenants, and restrictions in country clubs. Nazi propaganda from abroad was echoing in the United States through people like Henry Ford and Father Kaufman. In the 1930s, two of the leading anti-Semites in the United States were North Carolinians. One was US Senator Robert Reynolds, made the statement, you can't trust Jews, and he wanted to build a wall about the United States so high and so secure that no single alien or foreign refugee from any country upon the face of the earth could possibly scale or ascend it. This was in the 1930s when Jews were desperate to escape Nazi Europe. William Dudley Pelley, who fashioned himself the American Hitler, had his headquarters in Asheville. To North Carolina's credit, Pelley was driven from town, and Reynolds was so unpopular that he retired from politics. Not before, however, that Reynolds had succeeded in creating an Alien Registration Act of 1940 that required anyone who is not a naturalized citizen to register. Here we see Jean Traeger of Durham, a housewife. She'd been in America for 32 years, had to go to the post office, bring witnesses to testify to her good character. And on the alien registration forms, you see very often their nationality is listed as Jewish, or as in this case, Lithuanian Jewish, which is not to say that North Carolina didn't have its defenders. Two of the most prominent advocates of open immigration and also of Zionism in America were Frank Porter Graham, Chancellor of the University of North Carolina, and Josephus Daniels, who had been Secretary of Navy under Woodrow Wilson and Ambassador to Mexico under Franklin Roosevelt. During the war years, a number of prominent academic refugees came from Nazi Europe. Jewish refugees came teach at North Carolina or welcomed at North Carolina universities. William Lewis Stern came from Hamburg. He was a psychologist. His fame is from coining the term IQ, intelligence quotient. Raphael Lemkin had been a professor at the University of Warsaw and the district attorney. He escaped with Nazi documents and was brought to Duke. He coined the word genocide in his book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, and he was the author of the Genocide Convention adopted by the United Nations. Ernst Manasse was a philosopher from the University of Berlin who taught at North Carolina College for Negroes, now North Carolina Central University, where he became an emeritus professor. In Eastern North Carolina, in Van Eden, there was a colony of mostly Jewish Holocaust refugees who established an agrarian community that lasted from about 1939 into the 1940s. Again, these professors and business executives and art dealers were not very good dirt farmers. During World War II, Jews demonstrated their loyalty by flocking to join the army. The wartime cooperation really broke down barriers, not only because of the bonds formed by men, but North Carolinians who had been abroad saw the fruits of what racial hatred could do. Women worked at home in the Red Cross and for civil defense. A Jewish welfare board turned synagogues into USO centers where soldiers, Jewish and non-Jewish, could gather. And brotherhood became the civil religion of America. And as happened after the Civil War and World War I, there was a post-war religious revival that affected Jews no less than Christians. And new synagogues were built across America. This typically marked the movement from downtown to the suburbs. And the movement from the downtown to the suburbs usually also involved the transition from orthodoxy to conservatism. In 1910, there were 10 Orthodox synagogues in North Carolina. In 1960, there were none. And we see new congregations, new synagogue, Bethel is built in Durham, forms in Chapel Hill. A Hillel house is a religious school annex is added to Beth Or. In 1951, a new House of Jacob becomes, the congregation changes its name to Bethmeyer, and the new synagogue is built on West Johnson Street. Association of Jewish Men outfitted a bus as a synagogue, which was driven by a rabbi, which visited towns that were too small to have synagogues. But the circuit rider actually planted seeds for new synagogues to be created in places like Weldon and Lumberton. There was a sense of the North Carolina Jewish community as an extended family. Jews lived in their own parallel universe. They had their own organizations. Among them was the North Carolina Association of Jewish Women, the only state to have such an organization. The Jews spoke of the oneness of their community, a North Carolina Jewish community. They are bound together by their B'nai B'rith lodges, by their Hadassah chapters, at Wild Acres, an ecumenical resort operated by the Blumenthal family in Charlotte. The B'nai B'rith Institute met every young Jews fraternities and sororities, from BBYO meetings, from going to summer camp. Every town seemed to have a Jewish style deli. In Raleigh, it was Leah Levine's place where Jews would gather and meet each other, but it also drew politicos. If you want to know what was going on, I always heard, for example, in Greensboro, you went to Mushy Fine's Deli. It's where all the shakers and movers met. And the same thing with, if you want to meet with the state legislature or even the governor, you went to Leon Levine's upstairs deli. People are surprised to hear the South, historians describe it as the least anti-Semitic of America's region. They make the assumption that because of Black racism that there was Jewish hatred, but that's not necessarily the case. When I do oral histories, they usually tell me I never had any experience of anti-Semitism, but they'll qualify that with a but and talk about some incidents. Jews were rarely welcomed into high society, and the Jews had their own debutante ball in High Point. But the 50s and 60s witnessed a breakdown of social discrimination. Country clubs began accepting Jews, housing covenants were ruled illegal by the court, and the universities ended their quota system. When Abe Holtzman arrived to teach at North Carolina State in 1955, he could find only one other Jew on the faculty. Now Jewish faculty, of course, are commonplace. One place we see this is in the election of mayors. There are 14 Jewish communities in 14 communities, cities in North Carolina have had Jewish mayors. Mud Evans in 1951 was elected to mayor of Durham for 6 terms. Ken Brown was mayor of Chapel Hill. Steve Scholl is currently mayor of Durham. Perhaps the most notable Jew in North Carolina was, if not the most typical Jew, was Harry Golden. He was a wisecracking a journalist from the Lower East Side of New York who started the Carolina Israelite newspaper that really had a global circulation. Harry became a national celebrity, a friend of the Kennedys. He was a fixture on late night television. At one time, he had 2 books on the bestseller list, and he was famous both for his Lower East Side nostalgia and also as an advocate of civil rights. Another place where we saw the sign that Jews had made it was on the basketball court, which, as you all know, is a religion in North Carolina. In 1957, Lenny Rosenbluth, the New Yorker, led UNC to an undefeated national championship and was National Player of the Year. In 1963, Art Heyman of Duke was the national MVP, a combative player. But perhaps the greatest sign of Jewish acceptance was in 1971 when Connie Lerner, who was the daughter of Auschwitz survivors from Asheville, was an active in the B'nai B'rith youth, was elected Miss North Carolina. And if you notice from her picture, she is not a typical Southern blue-eyed blonde beauty. Where did Jews stand during the civil rights era? Well, as a Chapel Hillian said to me, Jews knew Blacks primarily either as customers in their store, as employees, as clerks, nannies, or yardmen. Polls showed that Southern Jews were more liberal than other Southern whites, but they were less so than Northern Jews. Jewish stores catered to Black trade, and Jewish merchants were often the first to hire Black clerks, extend credit to Blacks, or let Blacks try on clothes. When the Satiskis closed their dress shop, they turned it over to a Black employee. National Jewish organizations like the AJC had committed to civil rights, but Southern Jews had to balance their self-interest versus their principles. Bombs were set off during the civil rights era in synagogues in Charlotte, Gastonia, and Wilmington. Rabbi Abe Shane of I guess was Beth Jacob or Beth Meyer then, expressed a typical attitude when the Freedom Riders arrived in Raleigh in 1961, which included a number of rabbis. He went down there to greet them, but privately he disdained them. He thought they were publicity seekers who came down here, stirred things up, and then left it for the community to clean up, which is not to say that North Carolina Jews were not capable of speaking out. As I mentioned, Mud Evans was elected. The headlines when Mud Evans was elected mayor of Durham was "Negro vote elects Evans." We see a number of Jews who were very active in the civil rights movement, most notably Harry Golden, who kept coming up with these golden plans to reduce segregation to its absurdity. Martin Luther King was so taken with Harry Golden that he actually he cites him by name in his famous letter from the Birmingham jail. When the Freedom Riders arrived, again, they were disproportionately Jewish. Gertrude Weil was outspoken as a civil rights activist. And probably the most notable was Allard Lowenstein, a New Yorker who came down in 1945 to attend UNC. He led to the integration of the state student government. He returned to Raleigh in 1962 to teach at NC State, and he was a strategist for the local civil rights movement, famously bringing down the Liberian ambassador, Angie Brooks, to embarrass her, not to embarrass her, but to embarrass North Carolina for its segregationist policies. And it was Lowenstein's campaign that actually led to the desegregation of Raleigh. The civil rights era marked the changing landscape of North Carolina, the end of an era. This was also the time when the suburbs were rising, of urban renewal, the decline of downtown as retail centers. The North Carolina economy was changing. Cotton, textile, tobacco were no longer viable. In mill and market towns like Lumberton, Weldon, Wilson, Jewish communities expired, their synagogues closed. Merchants could not compete with malls or with the big box stores. Moreover, a second generation of Jews was going off to college. If you were a young Jew and went to UNC, Duke, or State and became an engineer, a CPA, a doctor, or lawyer, you didn't want to go back to your small town and work in your parents' store. If you go and look at for example, as the small towns decline, Wilson and Kinston synagogues are either dead or dying, whereas there's a new synagogue development in Greenville. What does Greenville have that these other communities don't have? ECU. Again, this is part of the the demographic change among American Jewry and the economic change in North Carolina. In 1959, a research triangle park is established in North Carolina. It was established on land that, by the way, the 4,000 acres that was owned by a Jewish mill owner, Carl Robbins, who is third from left there. And again, Jews were very prominent. There's Joseph Woodland, the inventor of the barcode, who worked at the park. Linda Birnbaum, who's at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, is just retired. Again, as I said, there's a demographic change in American Jewry, whereas in earlier generation, Jews were primarily involved in managerial and retail trades. Now they're tending to be involved in the arts and professions. Cities are no longer retail centers, but they're being reinvented as cultural and entertainment centers. So where do we see Jews now? One, of course, in college towns, two, in high tech and medical centers. If we look, for example, in our local community, North Carolina is proud to have, I think, 6 Nobel Prize winners. 3 of them are Jews associated with the research triangle. And this is also reflected in internal changes in Judaism, in the Jewish community. We speak now of a global South. There's a migration of Hispanics, Arabs, Africans, Asians to our community. And if you look internally at the Jewish community, you see Latino Jews, you see Asian Jews, Jews from Arab lands, and African-American Jews. Third, we find Jews in retirement centers. The demographics of American Jewry are aging, so we see new congregational developments in places like Pinehurst, Boone, Brevard, and Hendersonville. And fourth, we see them in exurbs. Jews, like everyone else, are getting driven or priced out of inner cities, and so we see new Jewish communities forming in places like Cary and Morrisville. There's a Havurah in Pittsburgh. If you go to Charlotte, there's new Jewish congregations in Concord and Davidson. And again, we see the changes. Jews are no longer outsiders. The Jewish mayor is commonplace. We have Jewish mayors not only in Durham now, but also in Asheville and in Whiteville. Also, Jewish acceptance as politicians. In 2016, for the very first time, with the election of Josh Stein as Attorney General, a Jew won statewide election. And in this past election, Kathy Manning became, of Greensboro, the first Jew to be elected to the US Congress. Mark Davis, who unfortunately did not win election, advertised in his campaign literature that he was the first Jewish member of the North Carolina Supreme Court. Marshall Rausch at one time was the most powerful, before the governor had a veto, was the most powerful politician in the state of North Carolina. And of course, we all know by now, Mandy Cohn is a North Carolina celebrity. If you start seeing the reflection of the development, if you look at the Jewish institutional growth in Durham, Chapel Hill, and Raleigh and Cary, it's pretty astonishing, the amount of activity. And we see this, there are over 40 Jewish congregations now could you move to the next slide, please? The next slide. There are over 40 Jewish congregations. We have Reconstructionist Jews, Humanistic, Hasidic, Jewish Renewal, and you don't necessarily have to be affiliated with the synagogue to express your Judaism. For example, we had the rise of JCCs, of day schools, and Hillel foundations. There are non-congregational ways that you can affiliate as a Jew by being involved in federation, in attending film festivals, the Triangle Jewish Chorale, going to the Judaica Art Gallery. You can take Jewish studies courses at the university and so on. And we see a Jewish presence across the built environment. If you go to Charlotte, you're going to go to the Blumenthal Art Center. You could study medicine at the Brody School of Medicine. Almost every city has a hospital named by a Jewish benefactor. And there are two towns, actually, cities in North Carolina named after Jews, Rossman and Robbins. Again, if we look at the local population statistics, we'll see from the 78 Jews in Raleigh in 1878 to perhaps 18,000 today in the Raleigh-Cary area, you can see what's happening across North Carolina. I invite you if you're interested in the subject, to join our Jewish Heritage, explore our Jewish Heritage North Carolina website. And I think with that, I'll be glad to entertain any questions.
Could you go back to that list where you had all the organizations for the area? That would be really appreciated. I'd like to take a photograph of that because I didn't know we had all the different organizations.
Yeah, sure. Or why don't you? Why don't I send it to you? If you just send me an email.
Sure.
I would like to know something about the synagogue at Tarboro and what is in that location now.
What's in that location now is an empty lot. It was a wooden building. It was built, I believe, in possibly the 1890s or early, maybe 1902 at the latest. It was a Queen Anne style wooden building. And that community largely declined. And the building was rented to a church, and then I understand the roof caved in.
Do you know what street it was on?
No, but I could find that out for you. There's a woman, and I'm having a senior moment in her name, who teaches at Edgecombe County Community College, who's an interesting woman who's taken upon herself to be the historian of Jewish Tarboro, and she would have those answers. She could draw a Jewish map of Tarboro.
Okay. Thank you.
Annette, if you want to read anything from the chat
Yes.
that's been going on.
Yes, I think there was clarification. There was a question, what happened to the House of Jacob, and that the House of Jacob became Beth Meyer Synagogue. And
Yes.
I know Leonard just addressed the Tarboro Synagogue. Larry Perlman made a comment, and the new Duke basketball coach is Jewish.
Yes, John Shire. I left out a lot. One of the stories I always like to tell is people date the Cameron Crazies actually to the presence of Art Heyman, who is a very combative basketball player. But the UNC Duke feud reached its climax and when two players, when Larry Brown, the point guard for North Carolina, and Art Heyman got into a fist fight on the court during the Duke UNC game. So here you had two Jewish boys from New York getting into a fist fight in North Carolina playing. So you always had the ethnic loyalty got kind of trumped by their collegiate affiliations. It wasn't enough to be Jewish to bind them together over Duke and UNC.
I have a question. Where are there, what are the Jewish schools for grades like preschool through 12 in North Carolina? Where are their schools?
Well, there's the Lerner Jewish Day School in Durham. There's, I guess, there's the Hillel School, I guess, in Chabad has taken over, I guess, the Jewish Day School in Raleigh. And I believe the same thing has happened in Charlotte to the day school there. And then at there's the, I guess it's the Beth Shalom School in Greensboro. There's a day school also there. The American Hebrew Academy, which was established in Greensboro as the world's first pluralistic Jewish prep school, it kind of faded away, economically collapsed a year or two ago, and is now a non-denominational school.
Okay. Leonard, just going back to the chat, there's a comment from Michael Schul. For seniors, you didn't mention the role of BJH.
Blumenthal Home.
Well, the Blumenthal Jewish Home was built in the, I guess, late 40s or 1950s or so as a residential home for Jews across North Carolina. What has happened to it, the North Carolina Jewish population just grew too large and diverse and pluralistic to support a single home. It was located in Clemens outside of Winston-Salem. So the home was sold, and the endowment now underwrites the Carolina Foundation for Jewish Seniors, which gives seed money to congregations such as your own, such as Beth Or, as well as other Jewish, other institutions that support the Jewish elderly across the state. But for a while there, they published a magazine called the Blumenthal family, the American Jewish Times Outlook, which became kind of a mouthpiece, publicity newsletter for the home, and was one of the things because in its earlier incarnations, every community would write a community report about what was going on in the community. It was one of the things that kind of bound North Carolina Jews as an extended family, but that also has come to the end, along with the Blumenthal Jewish Home.
Well, and I think that when you say that the Jewish community population in North Carolina got too big for the Blumenthal Home, to me, what happened was we started having large enough numbers of Jews so that in each community, you can find in Raleigh senior residences which have substantial numbers of Jews. So you could stay in Raleigh near your family, and you wouldn't have to go out to Western North Carolina to be with other Jews.
Yeah, that was also one of the rationales, which was as the Jewish population grew, increasingly people wanted to keep their elderly near them and not to bring them to Winston-Salem.
Okay, we have a few more questions from Rob Myers. I have heard that a Jew was one of the founders of the Carolina Country Club and was later excluded. Is that true or false?
I don't know that specifically, but it has a lot of credibility. The notion of this it happened in very many communities. For example, in Atlanta, some of the really, how should I put it, upper class societies and clubs like the Piedmont Driving Club and so on had Jews as founders and among their founding members. By the 1890s and certainly by the 1920s, Jews began to be excluded. There was always what was called an exception mechanism.
Albert Levine in Raleigh sold the land to the Carolina Country Club to build the Carolina Country Club. And his daughters, Al Levine's daughters, made their debut. And so they were members early on. I don't know exactly when, but it was before at least about 1950s, 40s or 50s.
Yeah, I did an oral history with Leah Levine, and she did tell me the story that her daughter did come out in one of the upper class cotillions. But I was just going to say there was an exception mechanism. For instance, very often a country club would say, they say, well, you don't have any Jews. And then they would say, well, in Greensboro, for example, there might be a Cohn from the textile family. Oh, yeah, but look, what about Cohn? He's a member. And there were one or two, they could always point to one or two members, someone who is, as they say, the exception. But
I have a question. To me, it sounds like I loved what you had to say, and it was so thorough and so well researched. And I learned so much. But as you can tell from my accent, I am a Southern Jew. And so I was curious, a lot of how many Jews became mayors of cities and so on, and that progression. Did that same thing happen in the northern areas where they were much larger populations of Jews who kept more to themselves instead of being so much a part of community?
Well, I think the strongest factor is the small town factor. A study of a fellow named Leishai Weisbach did a study of small town Jewish America, Jews in small towns. And you would find the same thing in the Midwest and the far West in small towns. It was much easier for Jews to integrate. Anti-Semitism was far less strong in small towns. So yes, I think that is a factor. That Jews, when you talk to Jews from small towns, regardless of region, they will tell you, our family integrated into town society. Right. Whereas if you grew up in Baltimore or New York or even Atlanta, we grew up in a Jewish neighborhood, and everybody I went to school with, and all my friends were Jews. I didn't really know any non-Jews. Right. So, it was quite a different thing. I mean, I had a similar experience. I grew up in a small town of Rutherford, New Jersey, which had 100 Jews, but just across the river. I didn't really have very many Jewish friends, and I did not grow up in a Jewish environment. But across the river in Passaic, my cousins grew up in a town with 10,000 Jews, and they grew up in an exclusive Jewish neighborhood enclave and had all the kinds of associations. We had a very different upbringings, and there was a difference between growing up in a small town and a larger city with a significant Jewish population.
Leonard, can you hear me?
Yes.
There was someone asked about the Raleigh Country, the Carolina Country Club, and the story is that Sam Ruby, who had Land's Jewelry Company in Raleigh, was a member of the Carolina Country Club. He went to World War II, and evidently they voted. There were people that voted against Jews while he was in service. When he came out of service, he found he was not a member of the country club. I've never researched that, but that's a story that I've heard.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've heard similar stories. I know Harry Kittner from Weldon told me he was nominated to, actually it was the Rotary example, and then found out he was blackballed by an anti-Semite. And interesting thing happened in Weldon, for example. Jews with the movement to the suburbs had bought homes in a development that surrounded a country club, and their the Jews were some northern mill owners came and established the country club and forbade Jewish membership. But some local ministers and local residents of Weldon went and said, no, they wanted Jews in their country club. They said, that's not the way we do things in Weldon. So Jews were accepted into the country club. So it really varied, as I go around, for example, it really varies by community. If you go to Greensboro, Jews found much wider acceptance in Greensboro, primarily because I think for two reasons. One, the Cohn family was there, and the Cohns dominated Greensboro economically. So you couldn't really very well turn your back on them. And second of all, Greensboro had a Quaker heritage, which was much more tolerant. On the other hand, if you just drive 15 or 20 miles down the road to High Point, which had an East European Jewish community, you'll hear Jews say, no, we could not join the country club, we couldn't join civic clubs or residential restrictions and so on. So it really depends upon the demographics and the culture of the particular community.
Okay, we just have a few other questions and comments. Ira Richmond is asking, why is there no kosher deli in Raleigh today?
There would be, or even a good deli for that matter. Interestingly enough, 100 years ago, it was much easier to get kosher meat. I don't know if any of you remember Alice Ehrlich, who was a very prominent artist and art teacher in Raleigh. Her father, Rabbi Rubenstein, was a traveling shochet. He would.
Who was that, Leonard? Who was that?
Rabbi Alice Ehrlich.
Alice Rubenstein Ehrlich.
Yes, her father, Rabbi Rubenstein, was a shochet. He would go around. A local farm would have a cow that was owned, that some local Jew owned, and he would ritually slaughter it. He had a circuit that took him around eastern North Carolina. So even if you lived in a place like Rocky Mount, the rabbi was going to come once every couple of weeks and he would slaughter a cow for you and you'd have kosher meat. There was usually a kosher butcher in town, a kosher baker. You could get meat was sent down by bus or train from Baltimore or from Richmond. So it was much more available, kashrut. I think things are changing now. We have Trader Joe's selling Empire chicken, but it's just probably a question of time. The rabbis, they called themselves rabbis. A lot of them were kind of self-ordained. The shochet would ride through town on Friday afternoon, and you would go to the rabbi's house and bring your chicken, and he would slaughter it for you, so you could have kosher chicken.
Thank you for answering that. From Karen Brody, do any of the Jewish schools go beyond grade 5?
I think the Garner Jewish Day School goes to grade 6, and I don't know about in Charlotte. I don't think they have a Jewish high school. Again, that also. The Jewish day schools have had a kind of rocky road. I believe that Chabad has moved in. There had been an independent Jewish day school in Charlotte, which I think has been taken over by Chabad. They tried to establish one in the Maccabee School in Asheville, but that did not make it either. The Garner Jewish Day School just goes up to 6th grade. So I don't think we have a Jewish high school. That was the intention of Marie's Chico Saba when he created the American Hebrew Academy in Greensboro. He wanted to create a Jewish high school in Greensboro. They didn't have the population to support it. So he came up with this idea of creating a boarding school. And it was not a model that was proved economically successful.
Okay, thank you. I think this may be our last question. Why is the Jewish history in North Carolina so different than Virginia?
Well, for some of the reasons that I outlined, one, we don't have the older now North Carolina is always the veil of humility between two mountains of conceit, as they say, which I think is ironic, since we're the place with the tallest mountains. But Virginia had Norfolk, and Richmond, we forget, is actually a port, even though it's upriver. So they had colonial settlements, and they had cities that developed. At one time, I remember looking at I think it's changed with Charlotte's growth, but North Carolina was like the 8th or 9th most populous state, but we didn't have any city that counted among the 35 largest. North Carolina was always a place of small towns that did not offer the opportunity, the urban opportunity. Jews are essentially an urban people. I think now we're the 9th most populated state, and I think Charlotte's maybe like the 22nd, I think. I might not have those numbers right. But again, it's always been, until very recently, a place of small towns that offered very little economic opportunity for Jews. This is changing with the kind of, as I say, with the Sunbelt economy and the post-industrial economy. Again, in South Carolina, the 1949, Beth Ahaba or Beth Shalom in Richmond dates to 1792. In 1820, 1 out of every 4 Jews lived in South Carolina. That was the Jewish capital of America. North Carolina didn't have anything. The port of Wilmington compared to the port of Charleston, for example. So there wasn't anything here to attract Jews economically, and that's only recently changed.
Okay, well, was there anything else in that, or should I wrap it up here?
No, I think we could wrap it up, and we want to
Okay,
thank you,
all right.
Leonard, so much for your excellent presentation.
Yeah, that was a great presentation, Leonard. We really appreciate it. I want to thank everyone in attendance and say, don't miss next Wednesday's edition of Shalom, y'all, when Temple Beth Or's own Southern members will be on a panel moderated by Larry Perlman and Annette Havison. So thank you all. Good night. And please keep watching for our adult ed programs. We got some great programs coming up this year. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leonard.
Thank you
you,
so
Leonard.
much.
Thank you, Leonard.
Thank you.